All right, welcome to the training, everybody. We are going to be talking about the defect rate today. And for those of you guys who are here with me live, there's about 25 of you. What's a defect rate? Some of you guys know that. I haven't commented on it for at least a few months. Every once in a while, I'll bring it up. But for those of you guys who do know, what's the defect rate? What does that mean anyway? Each account has one. My account has one, your account has one. Every account has a tracked defect rate. And you know the reason why we track your defect rate is if it gets too high, you run the risk of getting some sort of a slap on the wrist from eBay all the way up until just having your account completely suspended. So we're concerned about the defect rate. So what is it? Well, that's something that factors into it, Russell, that's for sure. If you cancel an order because you're out of stock, that's a negative event. Yep, you bet it is. Let me show you guys something. Within eBay, if you log into your eBay account, you should be able to come up here to the top left and go to account settings. Okay? You need to find your account settings section. And over here to the left, look where my mouse is right here. Over here at the left, you want to find your seller account. Or I'm sorry, not your seller account. Your seller dashboard. I told you wrong. Seller dashboard. Okay, this is a sample eBay account we're looking at right here. And if I go to a seller dashboard, it's going to tell me basically how my current level of performance is on eBay. See, selling on eBay is a privilege, right? You can make a significant amount of money, and you can do eBay and yourself a favor by making you both a bunch of money, or you can be a really bad seller and damage eBay's reputation, and they'll kick you off, right? Like, it can go either way. And so eBay, as a necessity, has to track your performance. They track it right here on your seller dashboard. All of you guys should be checking this on occasion, at least monthly, just to make sure that your account status is above standard or top rated. You want that to show above standard or top rated. And this option, or this section here below where it says if we evaluated you today, you also want this to show as above standard or top rated. Okay? If it's not, you could run the risk of A, getting a little suspension, B, maybe just having your listings decreased in ranking, or C, you can run the risk of getting your account or getting kicked off of eBay. Okay, this is your seller account. So eBay has these standards that you guys have to live by. Well, they made a change fairly recently. They announced this last year, but it came into fruition on February 20th of this year. They say starting February 20th, 2016, the following will no longer impact your defect rate. And again, guys, your defect rate is ultimately what causes your account to fall below standard. If you have too many defects, and I'm not talking about like, it's not a defect doesn't mean you sold a product that's malfunctioning or not correct. A defect is just their term when something doesn't go right according to them, and they have criteria for that. So it used to be that this bolded list right here used to cause defects on your account. And the more defects, the more likely it is you're going to have some negative consequence. But if a buyer left you negative or neutral feedback, that was a defect. If your detailed seller ratings, where somebody, after a transaction takes place, they're able to leave you a certain number of stars based on shipping and shipping time and communication and whatever. Those are called detail seller ratings. If you got low ones, that used to count as a defect. Return requests that are successfully resolved with your buyer, those used to count as a defect, oddly. So anyway, just a return request by the buyer. I always thought that was an odd metric. Items not received requests that are successfully resolved with your buyer. Those used to impact your defect rate. eBay's got a new sort of simplified system that I wanted to share with you just real quick. You guys need to know two things that affect your defects, okay? That affect your defects. That sounds funny. Okay, look over here to the right. The new seller standards will focus on what matters most to buyers, and they simplified it for us, which I like. They say new seller standards will focus on what buyers care about the most, getting the item they ordered on time and effective customer service to resolve any requests for help. A new simplified defect rate will include just two measures. Number one, you guys know a lot about this if you're doing drop shipping. The first measurement is seller canceled transactions for items that are out of stock or cannot be fulfilled for any other reason. That's number one. Every time you cancel a transaction because you're out of stock and you can't fulfill it, that counts as a defect. And then number two, it says in cases that are closed without seller resolution. I'll explain that better here in just a sec. I want to focus on the first one first. Now, don't let this bother any of you guys too much. I know some of you guys here are thinking, "Oh no, that's me. I've gone out of stock on something before, and I've had to initiate a refund and a cancellation because I was out of stock. Am I in huge trouble, right?" Well, not necessarily. You can be if you do it too often, but you won't be if it happens just on occasion. So the way they calculate your defect rate is they basically look at the aggregate of your transactions. So let's say, right, over the last year, you've had 75 transactions on eBay. Or let's make the numbers easy. Let's say you've had 100 transactions on eBay over the past running year, and you've had 3 defects, right? You've done that 3 times where you had to contact somebody and say, "Sorry, I'm out of stock. Let's refund and cancel the order." 3 times, you have a 3% defect rate at that point. Okay? Over the course of a year. And that's how they measure it too, because what's nice is if I have a bad month, let's say last year I had a horrible month in April and had a bunch of defects, and that's hurting my defect rate. It's pushing it up. It's way high right now because of it. But after this April comes and goes, that last April should fall off my account. So it's always like it's typically like a running 12 months. You guys need to be concerned about your defect rate. And especially in the world of drop shipping, you need to be concerned about the number of times that you cancel an order due to an out-of-stock issue. Because if it happens too often, 3 things are going to happen. Number one, or 3 things can happen as a result. Number one, you'll fall below standard, and you'll see it there under your account. And your listings, one of the penalties of a below standard account is your rankings won't be as good. eBay will penalize your rankings. So you don't want that, right? But that's not even the worst thing. The second thing they can do is they can give you a temporary suspension, not allow you to sell on eBay for a few weeks, or as part of that, they may cut down on your limit. They may say, well, your limit has been 1,000 items or $25,000 worth of merchandise, but we're going to cut it down to half. we're going to cut down the number of things you can list. Sometimes eBay will do that. Last thing they could do is they could just altogether kick you off of eBay. And in all the years that I've done this coaching and training, and I've been working with clients and all the hundreds and thousands of people we've talked to, I can only maybe count the number of clients I've worked with on maybe one hand that have had that happen, where eBay basically said you're done. You can't list anymore. Your defect rate is too high, and you're out basically. And when you get a message like that from eBay, you really are done. You can try to appeal it, or you can try to plead your case, but 99.9% of the time, you're out. eBay is going to look at you as more of a liability than an asset, and you'll be done. So I don't share all of this to scare you guys. Some of you guys I think already knew what a defect was, or maybe you knew that there was a defect rate that was being calculated. But the new simplified one is just really two measurements. Number one, seller canceled transactions. And number two, cases that are closed without seller resolution. Let me explain a little bit more what that means. This link will show us. I'm going to read from you right here so that I'm accurate in how I explain it. Valerie, let me answer your question first before I read this. Valerie says, will it be affected if they cancel because they just don't want it or for whatever reason? It won't be. So if it's a buyer who's wanting to cancel the order because they just simply change their mind or whatever, then that's not a defect. The defect is seller-initiated cancellations. So if I'm a buyer and I go find something and purchase it on eBay, and I pay my money, and then later the seller emails me back and says, oh, yeah, sorry, it's not available, and then refunds me, that's a defect on the seller. But if the transaction goes through, and then later I'm like, you know what, I really just don't want this item, that's not going to count as a defect to the seller. There are, Christina, there are ways to avoid this whole issue. And I'm going to give you just a couple of suggestions here in 1 second. So hold on to that thought. I'll give you a couple ways that we can circumvent this a little bit. So this is the second issue. When a buyer asks eBay to step in and help resolve an issue with a return request or an item not received request, and eBay determines that the seller is responsible for the issue, it will count as a closed case without seller resolution. And this is in quotes, and will be included in your defect rate, and will also count towards the separate requirement for closed cases without seller resolution. If eBay closes the case in favor of the seller or determines that no one is at fault, it will not count as a defect and will not impact your seller performance. So guys, think about it this way. Some of you may be aware of this happening, but sometimes as a buyer, let's say I buy something on eBay, and let's say, Christina, let's say you ship me a piece of outdoor furniture that I'm excited to get. And I get this piece of outdoor furniture, and it turns out you sent me the wrong one. Or it turns out you sent me one, but it was broken and didn't work right. And I'm mad about it. And instead of just contacting you directly, I have the option as a buyer to go tell on you, essentially. You know, like my little 4-year-old boy does to my little 2-year-old girl, right? Whenever she does something wrong, my 4-year-old is telling on her, right? This is basically what the buyer's doing to you. They could go and they can report the problem to eBay in what's called the eBay Resolution Center. And so eBay does what they open up a case. And if it gets to that level, and it did turn out that the item didn't work right and it was your fault as a seller, that's going to count as a defect. What you hope happens is that the buyer just comes directly to you, doesn't open up a case, and you're able to resolve it without it escalating to eBay. Because once eBay knows about it, there's a chance that you're going to get a defect. So Moral of the story is emphasize with your buyers that you want them, if there's a concern, to come to you first, so you can get things resolved. So those are the only two times that a defect takes place: out of stock or canceled transaction initiated by the seller, or this resolution center where eBay determines that it is your fault. That the item doesn't work right, or whatever the issue is that's brought up in the resolution center. Okay, knowing those two things, the question then remains, how do we prevent it, like Christina just asked. Before we get into that, let me check to make sure I've got all of your questions answered. Do you get a defect for not leaving feedback for the buyer? No. Nope. Feedback no longer affects your defect rate. Frank, you say if you catch an item before it gets sold and take off the listing because the item is out of stock, does it count against you? No. It only your defect will only take place if a transaction has taken place. So if you recognize that you have an item that went out of stock and you preemptively pull it off of eBay, that does not count as a defect, which is why it's wise to just check on your items on a somewhat regular basis when you're first starting. Yep, I agree with that, Russell. This kind of goes to how we can prevent defects. Russell says, on my recent issue, eBay told me that good communication to the buyer through eBay, meaning through their email system, will be good for your case when eBay reviews the item. So, like, for example, if an issue comes up and you clearly were trying to resolve it, and you do all of this through eBay, you're emailing back and forth, and you're just doing a great job with your customer service. If it gets to the resolution center and eBay looks at the case, like we're describing here, they're also going to read your emails, and if they determine that you did your best and it really wasn't your fault, it's going to go in your favor. So absolutely good advice, Russell. Do all your communication on eBay for that reason. You shouldn't be calling or emailing back and forth about it unless it's inside of eBay's parameters. Good thought. Really good thought. Christina, you say, but leaving positive feedback on a buyer can increase rankings, correct? No, not necessarily. You leaving positive feedback for a buyer doesn't necessarily help you at all, unless the buyer turns around and leaves you positive feedback, which will in turn help you. So you as a seller leaving feedback doesn't help you. It helps you indirectly, because sometimes if you leave feedback as a seller, that increases the likelihood of your buyer leaving feedback for you, and that feedback that you receive certainly helps your account. Let me give you a couple of pieces of advice. When you're in the drop shipping business, you're in the business of potentially running out of stock here and there, right? Some of you guys are shaking your head like, yeah, you better believe it. I've had lots of out of stock issues. And especially as a new seller on eBay, you probably are having your fair share of out of stock issues, because you're still learning the ropes, A, and then B, you're also still sifting through suppliers trying to find somebody who's going to be consistent, right? That's all part of learning this whole process. So you're subject to more of those out of stock issues. Couple of pieces of advice here when trying to lower our defect rate so we don't have very many issues, okay? Number one, remember that your defect rate is calculated based on the number of defects versus successful transactions. You need to keep a low rate. I'm talking, you want to keep like a lower than 2% defect rate. Your goal should be 0 defects. Realistically, you want to be lower than 2%. If you're above that, you start putting yourself in a position where you can get some of those consequences that we talked about from eBay. Negative consequences, that is. So, it doesn't take a math genius to figure this out. There's two ways to improve this. If it's defects divided by total transactions, you need to either lower your defects and or increase the number of positive transactions you have. If I've only had 100 transactions in the space of a year and 5 of them have had defects, I've got a 5% defect rate. The way to lower that is to have more positive transactions. Well, that may seem obvious to you, but there's some ways that you can help yourself in that effort. For example, if I'm a business owner and I sell very few items because my items are larger in nature, maybe I'm a furniture company on eBay, and maybe I only close 10 sales a week, but the sales I do make me a bunch of money. But the nature of my business is that even if I get one defect in a week, that's a 10% defect rate, right? Because I'm only doing 10 transactions a week. So one thing that you can consider doing is what can you do to sort of artificially push up the number of transactions you have? Not even artificially, just what can you do to push up those transactions? And there's two thoughts I have. One is to start selling a bunch of cheap stuff, like really inexpensive stuff that you can sell very quickly, even sometimes at the expense of taking a loss. For example, some of our clients get taught to start selling sports cards, or you could sell some sort of collectible card, right? And you can sell it at a loss often. You could start an auction on any random sports card for a penny and free shipping, and in most cases you'll sell it. And you may not sell it for enough to cover shipping or to cover the cost of you buying a brand new pack of cards, but that doesn't matter. Maybe you lose 30 cents on the transaction, but isn't it's great because you have full control over that. You're not going to run out of stock because it's your item. You can list it for sale and feel confident that you're going to be able to fulfill the order, so it's going to be a successful transaction. So it basically just costs me 30 or 40 or 50 cents to buy myself a successful transaction. See, in the eyes of eBay, a transaction is a transaction, whether it's a transaction for a $1,500 piece of furniture or a transaction for a 30-cent baseball card. It's weighted the same, which seems a little silly, but it is. So if I want to pad my defect rate in my favor, I'm going to go out and buy a bunch of sports cards, and I'm going to sell them for cheap, and I'm going real cheap, right? Even at the expense of maybe losing a few bucks. And I'm going to sell a whole bunch of them to pad my numbers, so that the next time I go out of stock on something, I'm not sweating about it, thinking that I'm toast because my defect rate's going to be too high because I pad those numbers with those. I called them artificial sales. They're real sales, but I guess it's artificial in the sense that it's not a core part of your business. Okay? It doesn't have to be sports cards. For me, I source some stuff directly out of China. If you're interested, AliExpress.com is a great place to do it. AliExpress, AliExpress. You can source dirt cheap stuff out of China that does carry some value. I'll just show it to you right here, AliExpress.com. Buy some cheap inventory and sell it. Cheap. No, well, we're not talking a lot. It's easy to do your own shipping, by the way, guys. So it's not a lot to ask to sell small items or baseball cards or even small pieces of jewelry, because shipping is cheap. You can print the label right from your computer, and it's a great way to pad that feedback. Okay? So that's one way. The second way is when you do need to cancel a transaction, just try to resolve it before you actually have to cancel it. So if you can find it and fulfill the transaction at a higher price, as long as it's reasonable, do it. Say your supplier doesn't have it, but you can find it elsewhere, go ahead and do that. Offer alternatives. If you can find it in green, but you sold it in gray, offer it in green and maybe offer a little discount to keep the transaction. If you're forced to cancel it and offer a refund, there is an option when you're asked why. So if you do a cancellation and you're asked why you're canceling it, I've heard of some people saying that instead of choosing that they went out of stock, you can choose an option that says the buyer changed their mind, which really isn't honest. I don't teach it that way. I would prefer us be honest in our business. But if you want, I've heard that that's a way that you can do it. So you just select instead that, the buyer changed their mind, and I guess you could spin that in a way that I guess that's true in a way. They didn't want it in green, they bought it in gray. They didn't want it in green, so I guess you could say they changed their mind. I don't know. You can spin anything, I guess. I would prefer you guys to be honest about things, but I think you can select another option, and then that won't count as a defect. So that's an option too. Or just as another suggestion, if you're finding that your supplier, maybe it's Walmart, maybe it's Target, maybe it's some XYZ company that I don't know about it, if they're having lots of out-of-stock issues, change your supplier. Use somebody else. There are other suppliers that are going to be more consistent with your inventory that will lead to fewer out-of-stock issues. Okay? Those right there, for you, Christina, and for the rest of you guys that are wondering, those are my suggestions on how to lower that defect rate. Yes, Russell, you can see your current defect rate. Again, you simply come in here to Account and Seller Dashboard. And it'll show right here, Transaction Defect Rate. And you can see on this specific account of mine, this is sort of more of my buying account, so I don't do a lot of selling on this account, but it says 15 transactions here. So I have 0 of 15 transactions that have a defect. So I've got a 0% defect rate on this account, but you can see it there under your seller dashboard. You can check in to see how you're doing. Okay, good. Glad you started, Valerie. It might take a couple of weeks to get stuff delivered, but looks like Valerie's getting some stuff from AliExpress as we speak. Jackie says, what if they don't receive the item and tracking says that it has not been delivered? What to do? Contact your supplier first, probably. You may have to contact whoever the courier is in this case, so FedEx or UPS or the post office. It's on them, certainly, so you'd want to follow up with them directly about it. That hasn't happened a lot to me, to be honest. So if it were me in that situation and I've got the tracking number and it doesn't say that it's been delivered, I'd follow up with the post office to see what's going on, or whoever shipped it out. But no, it won't go against your defect rate, though, Jackie, if that's what you're asking. Especially it won't go against your defect rate if your buyer doesn't contact you later and open up a case with eBay. Remember the Tattletale example? As long as they don't open up a case there and escalate it to eBay's customer service, it won't be a defect. It may not have just updated. Like, I've had it to where the post office has tried to deliver something and the person didn't scan it as delivered and it sits there like you're saying, but the person got the item, no problem, and it never escalates. And that's probably what happened. It probably just never got scanned. Yeah, that's probably what happened then, Jackie. Probably didn't get scanned, and it's not a big deal. It's not going to affect your defect rate at all. All right, guys. Well, hopefully this has been helpful. I guess the takeaway should be that you go out and check your current defect rate, wherever it's at, whether it's high or low, implement some of the changes we suggested, and start lowering it so that we don't have any of those negative consequences as we continue to work with eBay. I'm glad it's been simplified. It used to be a lot more complex. Now that we just have these two issues that we have to consider, it makes it a lot better. All right, guys. Have a wonderful weekend to you as well. We'll do eBay again next week. Hopefully this was helpful to you in what you're doing with drop shipping and with eBay. We'll be doing more on Friday, same time, same place. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.